All right, I think we're live here. So, hello, my name is Miki Turner. You can find me on the Twitters at TurnerESQ, and I run a website called socceresq.com where I talk about legal issues in soccer. And I'm joined here with a couple of esteemed colleagues, and I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Kartik. Give everyone a hello and introduce yourself, of course.
Hi, I'm Kartik Krishnaiyer. I write various places, including Yanks Are Coming with my colleague Neil Blackmon, who we're about to introduce, and World Soccer Talk, among other places, sportbusiness.com as well.
And I am Neil Blackmon, and I am the co-founder of yanksarecoming.com. My work's a lot of different places, and I am also an attorney with a practice where I focus on civil rights and employment discrimination litigation.
All right, thanks. And so, yeah, we just decided to come here and chat about all things Miami. There's been a lot of, obviously, information coming down over the last, 4 years, 5 years? I think we're right around the 5th year anniversary of Beckham announcing his attempt to get an MLS stadium built in Miami. And it's come to this. It's come to him deciding to at least move temporarily to Fort Lauderdale for a temporary site for his stadium. And that's obviously not without controversy as well. So we just decided we wanted to chat about all of the issues that have come about since this announcement was made 5 years ago. I think it's literally the 5-year anniversary. And then also talk about the Fort Lauderdale aspect of it and just kind of the history of it, of everything as well. So
the irony is actually, since you mentioned that, Mickey, the 5-year anniversary of that announcement was the week that they revealed their plans for Fort Lauderdale. So I that wasn't intentional, but that was the irony.
Yeah, it's just been one of those things. I mean, on some level, I obviously feel some sorrow for them, just because this is not one of those situations, and hasn't been, where they have been trying to get a whole bunch of public subsidies. Whatever you think about the deal on its merits, the public subsidy portion of it really hasn't been there, and they've just had such a difficult time with all the locations, which we're going to get into here in a minute. Such a difficult time trying to get a location to get a stadium that they've, by and large, been wanting to pay for by themselves. That has something to do with the history of sports in Miami, as far as just trying to get these things built and the other deals that have come through, and just the skepticism about those types of sports deals, as well as just skepticism with Miami government. But, that's, you got to live in the world you're in, and it's just made it much more difficult for them, at least at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it really has. If you think about the back to the 5-year anniversary thing's particularly important, just because if you think of how old Marlins Park is, they kind of entered into this thicket when they announced that they wanted to have a team, and people were really excited about the prospects of MLS, but not so excited about any prospect of spending one penny of taxpayer money on a stadium. So that was part of the idea behind the big promises at the outset. Hey, we're going to pay for our stadium. We're going to have the plot of land. We're going to do it all ourselves and finance it ourselves, because the city was really still reeling from basically, I'm cautious with the word swindled as an attorney, and certainly Mickey knows all about that. But Jeff Loria, he took the taxpayers of Miami for a ride with Marlins Park, and it's still a sore spot 5 years later.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, since we talked a little bit about the history, I guess let's talk a little bit about just the history of soccer, professional soccer, I should say, in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, for those who may not have been paying as much attention. So obviously the Miami Fusion were the former MLS team, came into existence in 98. Is that right?
Yeah.
And subsequently went out of existence in 2001. Or 2000, which one was it? Do you recall? It was right around there, right around the turn of the century.
2001. Yeah,
2001. So, and the reason essentially for that, and you guys would certainly know a bit more about this than me, being down there. There were stadium issues, number one, and then there were some ownership issues, number two. Was there anything else, generally speaking, or was that were those the main two issues that led to the demise, along with MLS being in a not a great state?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of what happened with the Miami Fusion has been spawned and misrepresented through time. I think number one, you had the first owner who overpaid for a club in MLS, and Ken Horowitz, and he was a guy that was a millionaire, but he wasn't a billionaire, and it was you needed to be a billionaire to sustain an MLS club. Lockhart proved to be a pretty good venue, and the attendances were good at times, but the team was very inconsistent until that final year. And in 2001, the team was good. The attendance was decent, but Horowitz was essentially out of money and wanted to cash out of MLS. The question at that point with MLS and the financial condition they were in, whether do you fold the league? Do you contract certain teams? What do you do? And while, looking at how the teams were progressing, or get rid of some other, Dallas was a league-owned team at the time, potentially get rid of Dallas. San Jose had passed through owners. It had been league-owned, then the Crafts took it, then they dumped it on Anschutz. It became logical to get rid of the two Florida teams because of geography, firstly. Secondly, because of Horowitz's financial limitations. And then thirdly, Tampa Bay being a league-owned team and no real stadium solution possible in Tampa Bay. So I think the Fusion has gotten a bit of a bad rap. People want to automatically make assumptions that MLS in 2001 is like MLS in 2019. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah. I mean, MLS was a basket case league in 2001. Been as motivated to go to an MLS venue in 2001 doesn't mean they won't be in 2020. So I really push back on any talk about the Fusion and how that is instructive to what happens. Now, again, we don't have that much data, so I understand why people fixate on it, but I'm here to tell you that it's not really that valid.
Yeah, and then so they depart, and the Fort Lauderdale Strikers come in to the NASL. That's
2011,
correct, right?
Yeah.
A little later on, and they take over Lockhart Stadium, which is where the Fusion used to play. But they're short-lived. Essentially, they had a number of the same problems, at least as far as ownership is concerned. But
which I can personally attest to, unfortunately.
Yes. I was about to say, Kartik is intimately aware of the Strikers' issues. So they kind of a shooting star. They were here one day, gone the next. And we'll certainly talk a little bit about them later on, but we just wanted to give you people who may not have paid much attention just kind of a background. So David Beckham comes in 2007, signs with MLS. I almost said the MLS. I don't want to get yelled at for that.
Yeah.
Signs with MLS in 2007. His contract allows him the option to purchase a team for around $25 million. He plays for the Galaxy for 5 years, does pretty well after a early, stops and starts, let's call it that. And then retires, and then decides in 2014 to exercise his option to purchase a team. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance. I remember Garber going down there with the teal and black scarves and holding up the soccer ball with Beckham. And they announced that they're going to Port Miami to try to build a soccer stadium. And that does not go very well. Almost as soon as it starts, they start going for that. It doesn't go anywhere, and they are forced to abandon it. Now, from your guys' view down there, what exactly happened there? Was it just a lobbying effort, or was there anything else going on?
It was primarily lobbying. There were going to be some zoning issues. They were going to need a why is the word escaping me right now? It's not an exemption, but a different word that I'm looking for. A variance. There it is. A variance.
Zoning law. Yeah.
They were going to need a variance. They didn't even really get that far because they were like, even if we were able to lobby to get this property off the ground, we'd still need a variance, which would require an altogether different lobbying effort. And like I said, at that point in time, there was this political thicket still related to Marlins Park. So that made any sort of lobbying effort very difficult. And I think really they had always kind of suggested that they were going to be more independent in terms of their financing. But that was when they started pushing that narrative to the press.
And once that happened, they pretty much quickly abandoned any thoughts of going there. And then they went to somewhere around American Airlines Arena, is that right? To try to get something there, and that didn't go very far. That was again abandoned pretty quickly.
Yeah, they were looking at a piece of land. Well, actually, it's not a piece of land. It's a piece of water, but that could be filled in, the slip, they call it colloquially, between the American Airlines Arena and Museum Park, which is the park we have on the north end of downtown Miami, where all the museums, the Science Museum, the Art Museum, the Children's Museum, et cetera, are. That they would have to fill in that land, and that there would be enough room there for a stadium. That got abandoned real quickly.
Yeah, and then and then I think they went. Next stop was Marlins Park, and that's been written about quite extensively, because I think that's about the time when people started wondering if this thing was ever going to happen. They tried to fit in a plot of land next to Marlins Park, and there were so many issues there that it made you wonder why they even tried it in the first place. Number one, the square footage, the footprint there was going to be very tight. And then number two, and I think which this really riled a bunch of people up, the Marlins seemed to control basically that entire area. I think they own basically, the local.
It is part of their lease with the city, which is part of, Neil introduced us to this whole issue of Jeffrey Luria and the city of Miami. They have control over all of the retail space and everything around the park.
Yeah.
With the case study in any sport management class now, anywhere on the planet, probably, for mismanagement and public giveaways. It's just, I'm sorry I started laughing, but.
No, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Any mental going.
But I'm trying to remember. I should have brought it because I wanted to. Some of the things that they have, veto rights over or what have you, were just so outlandish and crazy that you just makes you wonder how anybody could agree to that. But again, they did. So it basically gave the Marlins control over that entire tract of land and the surrounding area. It made it impossible for Beckham to even really operate there, even if he wanted to.
Right.
Correct.
And then so we go to Overton, which is a plot of land where they have had some success legally, but it's not really translated to them wanting to actually build anything there. Essentially, they reached an agreement with the city and the county, I think, in 2018. And then they were sued by a local citizen, Bruce Matheson, basically alleging that the city, or is it the city or county? I always get those two mixed up.
The county. It
was the county. All right, that's what I thought. So basically alleged that they had to open the process for purchase of the land up to bid. The county and Beckham's group argued that they can do a basically no bid deal as long as it's at market value and has economic benefits to the surrounding area. And that lawsuit they won at the court level, trial court level, excuse me. In fact, they won fairly emphatically. They've won every step of the way here. They've then appealed. Matheson then appealed to the Court of Appeals. Beckham's group won there, and now we're before the Florida Supreme Court, waiting to see what they do.
Right.
And then, and Neil, have you read that the legal pleadings and what have you, or at least glanced over them? Because it's kind of interesting that the court has basically again sided with Beckham at every step along the way, and overwhelmingly, really. I mean, Matheson really hasn't had a leg to stand on, at least as far as the court's been concerned.
Yeah, I mean, they're not advancing a particularly strong argument about the nature of the bidding process. I think the political background of the lawsuit is far more fascinating than the pleadings, because, like Miki said, Beckham's not gonna lose this lawsuit, and it would be stunning if after winning at every level, it got sent back to the circuit court by the Supreme Court of Florida, but by the Florida Supreme Court. But just the fact that the Overton Development Board and the Dream Defenders were happy to front some of the bill for Matheson's legal fees. And Matheson is this guy that this is kind of one of the things he does. He's a rabble rouser and a guy who uses. And I think it's great. I think this has been a legal strategy in this country for hundreds of years. This is what you do. I mean, he uses the court as a check on counter majoritarian policy, right? So he didn't feel like the will of the people in Overton, which is really just an old historic African American community,
minority community.
Yeah, that has been deeply segregated by various policies that the city of Miami has implemented for 60 to 70 years. And Matheson, along with the Dream Defenders, were kind of like, enough is enough. So there's the political background to it that kind of everywhere they've turned in Miami, somebody's been irritated that they want to build a stadium in Miami. And there's a lot of like NIMBYism going on. But I think in Overton, that's probably the place where they have the most, legitimate claim. And that's what's so odd about the fact that they've had a lot of success there in terms of winning.
Real quickly about Overtown. It's an area that at least locals here like to think of as kind of the Harlem of the South, with that kind of African American heritage and history. And it's a place that got devastated by the building of the interstate highway right through it. Got devastated by the building of another expressway, the East-West Expressway, right through it. And then these kind of public facilities which people come and use, and then they don't really give back to that community. They come and use like the Miami Arena, the old Miami Arena, and then they leave. So there's I just don't think there's any, and it was always kind of an odd choice. But as we said, legally, they still own that land. They're probably going to win the legal battle there, and that remains potentially an option down the road. I don't know if we want to get into that discussion now, but that's potentially an option down the road for them.
Yeah. So, and that, we'll get into that in a minute. And, Jorge Mas, who we'll again talk about shortly, has frequently said, when he came into this, he realized that Overton wasn't a site that they would prefer to use for a number of reasons: gentrification, the footprint of the stadium, traffic issues, and all that kind of stuff. And so, it remains an option. They will use it, I think, if it comes to that. If the, what we're going to talk about in a second, the Melreese development doesn't work. And so I think it's, he's been pretty upfront, Moss has, about why he doesn't want to use that plot of land. But that's just kind of where he's at this point. Is Neil's mic muted? Now it's not.
Okay.
So no, Moss has been really upfront about it, and he injected the whole process with a lot of credibility in Miami, among Miami power brokers. So I think when he came on board, it gave them some credibility politically to do things like say, we're going to be able to do. It gave him credibility in Overtown, especially. And so I think they do want to kind of not have to use that. But yeah, I mean, they will if Melreese continues to go bad. Maybe it's best to kind of transition there.
Yeah. And so the last location that they've wanted to take a look at, and where they are currently negotiating, is Melreese, which will in the future be named Miami Freedom Park. And this is where Jorge Mas, developer, businessman, came in about a year ago, actually, to partner with Beckham to try to save the Inter Miami bid. I think at the time when they were negotiating Melreese, Moss actually mentioned that they were, steps away from basically giving up on Miami as a soccer, as an MLS city, because they just had no luck trying to find a plot of land that would work for them. So Melreese is a golf course in part, and there are some other issues with the land, which you guys, I'm sure, could elaborate on. And so they put a proposal together to basically redevelop 150 plus acres of land into a soccer stadium, office space, green space, that kind of stuff. They went in last summer to the city commission on fairly short notice and tried to negotiate a deal. Not so much a deal, but because of the way the city Miami City charter is written, they have to send any proposals to the or send a proposal to modify the charter to the voters, which they did in November. They got that vote passed 3-2, and the voters overwhelmingly, to be fair, authorized them to negotiate the deal. Now they haven't negotiated; they didn't authorize them to sign off on anything, but they didn't authorize them to negotiate the deal to redevelop the land and put a lease together. But it's not been smooth sailing since then, or really at any point along the way. And so right now we're in a place where they are trying to negotiate a lease development agreement for that 150-acre tract of land to get the stadium built and office space and other amenities. And that's kind of where we are right now. There's actually a meeting tomorrow where they're supposed to get a progress report. And there's actually some reporting out there that we may see a proposed lease tomorrow, although I don't know if that's actually going to happen. But just moving back, this whole process for them has been as difficult as it has been everywhere else.
Yeah, if not more so, for a couple reasons. One is, again, they've had to deal with the politics of it. They did win the referendum, and they won decisively, not without spending quite a bit of money on political advertisements to accomplish that end. But a win is a win, and a decisive win is better. But there's also influential political people, particularly on the left in Miami, that have not been very thrilled about using one of the city's largest public green spaces as the site of a soccer stadium with a large retail piece. And so people like Billy Corbin, people like Grant Stern, and some other power brokers in terms of progressive politics in Miami have kind of led the charge against it. And, they're kind of up against it in terms of their margin for error because for reasons we'll probably get into, the lease has to be voted on in September. And the way that works in the city of Miami bylaws, they need 4 votes to secure approval. It's not a majority vote, and they're going to lose a commissioner. So, there's a lot of issues with that particular use of green space. And the PGA Tour, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but they do have one of their, I forget the name of the program, First Tee. So they have a First Tee program that they'd run out of Melreese for many years. And finding a suitable location for First Tee has been difficult. So, there's a whole lot of stuff that's still obstacles, layers on layers of obstacles, really.
Couple additional points on that too. Is on Lejeune Road, the traffic on the 836, which is the East-West Expressway, the Dolphin Expressway, are miserable. And the 836 is already going through a major reconstruction with local tax money. That's the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority, without much help from the state of Florida, from FDOT, to get that project done. You're going to throw even more traffic on those streets. The East-West Expressway being, again, a county MDX managed road. It's not an interstate. It's not a U.S. highway, a federal highway. And then Lejeune Road, which is a state road. And then you have Douglas Road going through there. You're going to have to do something to accommodate all that additional traffic on Saturday afternoons or Sunday afternoons, whenever there are MLS matches, plus the retail. So you've got the commissioner at the city level and the Commissioner Joe Martinez at the county level, that represent that area of the city of Miami, or in Martinez's case at the county level, fundamentally opposed to this because of the traffic and what it will do to that residential neighborhood. Then you add the green space issue, which is why I've been skeptical about Melreese, as I've written, including for Youngstercomic.com. There is not a whole lot of green. I'm actually closer to Fort Lauderdale. I actually live in Broward County, but I think of the entirety of South Florida as my home, and Miami being the primary city in South Florida. We do not have the amount of green space. A place like, Miki, you'd be familiar with Seattle and Vancouver. Vancouver has Stanley Park, which is brilliant.
We just don't have enough land.
Yeah, we just don't have land. So whatever remaining green space there is, from my perspective as a local resident and someone who consumes those parks in the area, need to be preserved. I mean, I just spent last week in our state capital in Tallahassee, which is a smallish town, but where they preserved a lot more green space than Miami has. And it's a smaller place, which is kind of bursting at the seams right now, but they have preserved urban park space in a way that Miami and Fort Lauderdale have not. So that's why this is a fundamental issue with Melreese, and I think it's also going to be potentially for some people an issue with Fort Lauderdale and the lack of park space there. And I'm sure we're going to get to that soon.
Yeah, I don't want to hold up the discussion too much, but Miki brought up an important point, which was how quickly they moved to go to Melreese and how it was surprising. And it was surprising and it was fast, and their preparedness in terms of their bid proposal reflected that. They did not have a traffic study done. They had no idea about a lease proposal. They had no answer to the PGA about what would become a first tee. So those sorts of little I'm going to call them procedural errors, have kind of plagued Inter Miami from the beginning. And I mean, to be quite candid, because you're talking to two guys who really want professional soccer to succeed in South Florida, of course. To say they've been problematic undersells it.
Yeah, I mean, and part of that is just a function of their failure at every other step along the way to secure a stadium location.
Yep.
And even when they secured Overton, you bring in Moss, and he, as a local guy, which is one of the things that probably was missing from their previous efforts, as not having a local guy in there to really dig in there and see what would be a good location and solution. He comes in there and says Overton's not going to work for X, Y, and Z, and they immediately switch over. I don't want to get too much into the reasons why they're so insistent on this, but obviously they have their sight set on Miami as a desirable market, which it certainly is, for just logistical reasons, having a partner for Orlando and Atlanta, and for television reasons, for improving their TV contract. So that's that's a good, that's my supposition as to why they've been so dead set on getting this done, notwithstanding all the issues they've had. But again, that's a little far afield from what we're discussing here. And so just briefly on the, we've got five commissioners that need to approve this deal. Based on my counting, they've got 2.5 at the moment.
Yep.
And
that's right.
There's at least one undecided. And then Gort and Reyes, if I'm correct, are the two that are probably no's, at least at this point, and Reyes is a certain no at any point. Is that a fair summation of the situation on the commissioner's attitude?
Yeah, Gort is the key. Reyes, I'm trying to think of some sort of pop culture reference to sound cool, but it's not happening.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. I'll just leave it at that. So the thing about Reyes pushed for the early vote just so he could vote against it.
Yeah.
Because he needs to be able to vote against it in his reelection, so he can say, I stood up to the Jeff Loria types of the world. And so I mean, Gort's leaving though. He's term limited. Yeah. So it's really just a matter of whether Moss and his power brokers can make Gort some sort of offer that is acceptable to him. How can we make your post-commission life better?
So just briefly on Gort, that's whose district this development would be in.
Yeah,
so,
sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah, he has certainly a vested interest in how it turns out, and he's I think he's a no at this point if the vote was today, but I think it's certainly fair to say that he can be swayed. I don't know what it would take to sway him, but that's certainly where their efforts have gone, I think, and as far as lobbying is concerned. Although he says that they haven't done too much at this point.
In terms of Gort, he's been involved in city politics for 30 years or more, and he's a guy that's taken a lot of bad votes in the past and has done some good things. I think for him this is very much a legacy issue because of the specter of Loria and some of the other things that had actually happened with the commission before that related to that Orange Bowl site. And related to my point of view, it's unlikely he flips, and they need him to flip.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're not going to get it. Even if they have a solid Russell and they have a solid Carollo, there's some question marks on all of that, right?
Yeah,
we know they have Hardiman, that we've known all along. But it's going to be real interesting to see what the squeeze is now after the Fort Lauderdale thing, because I think that's just another element in this conversation that is new, but is so pertinent that maybe it changes the attitudes of some of the commissioners, whether it makes them want to get a deal done quicker, or whether it tells them, forget it, Inter, you guys just stay in Fort Lauderdale. I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out, but we're going to no real.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point to turn it over to Fort Lauderdale and discuss what happened there. So, as we talked about a little earlier, there was a proposal from XFE Football, which does a bunch of stuff with bringing big teams in for friendlies and what have you, to redevelop Fort Lauderdale's Lockhart Stadium, which has sat abandoned since the Strikers left. And they were set to make a proposal at some point in the near future, but unbeknownst to them and in a bit of a surprise to the rest of us, Inter Miami came up with a proposal to renovate, or I guess basically tear down Lockhart Stadium and build an 18,000 seat stadium, which was to house a USL team. Now that raised a bunch of eyebrows for, I think, everyone, because constructing an 18,000 seat stadium for a USL one side seemed to be absolutely preposterous, considering the attendance for even well-attended USL championship sides is around 11 to 12,000. So you're going to go one level down and build a stadium that no one at the championship level, save Cincinnati, could fill. And I think I wrote the day before, basically, like, this made no sense. Obviously, they're going to do something to get Inter Miami there, at least on a temporary basis. And then, lo and behold, the Friday 2 weeks ago, Beckham and Moss come out, or maybe it was Thursday, but Beckham and Moss come out to Lockhart Stadium and make an announcement that they are going to play temporarily at Fort Lauderdale for 2 years at Lockhart Stadium, build an 18,000 seat edifice, and play there while they try to get the Inter Miami stadium location at Malmreese over the line. So there is a whole bunch of stuff going on here, and it's almost difficult to know where to start. You've got the obviously how long they are actually going to be there, the impact of getting Malmreese over the line or not. You've got the XFE football side of things and what they're going to do as a result of all of this, and then what's going to happen with that stadium if they get Malmreese over the line. Are you going to continue with an 18,000 seat stadium for a USL one side? Kartik, I'll just let you go. Just go.
Go.
So thanks. I think their cost is a lot, as you mentioned earlier, Miki, and I think that's a big part of this. Moss understands that historically the greater percentage of the fan base for men's professional soccer in South Florida have come from Broward and Palm Beach counties. They come from points further north, and in Dade County they tend to be west. They tend to be in Kendall and Doral, which are west of the city of Miami, southwest in the case of Kendall, the city of Miami. So I think he was always counting on, since he got involved in this Broward County and Palm Beach County from points north down to the city of Miami, then perhaps MLS and David Beckham previously were counting on. Secondly, my understanding is he always, the minute he got into this deal, felt like he was going to play out the string in Miami-Dade County, but felt like Broward County was a better place to have his academy, the DA and all the youth programs associated with Inter Miami, because it's centrally located in the metropolitan area. And I think the dynamic itself, it's longer than any metropolitan area in the country, and it's not very wide. We're 10, 15 miles wide at our widest point. Maybe at some points 20, but generally no. And we're 70 miles in length. So it's a place you have to drive great distances to get anywhere. And actually, Miki, your metropolitan area, this Seattle metropolitan area, is maybe one of the closest comparisons we have.
Very narrow.
Because Puget Sound, and the mountains kind of constrain you from Tacoma all the way north. So it's similar to that. I mean, you have to drive great distances. And like in that metropolitan area, Seattle is roughly the midpoint. Here, even though Miami is the primary city and Fort Lauderdale is your kind of equivalent of Tacoma, Fort Lauderdale is the midpoint. So for whatever reason, historically, this would be the fifth that either intended to play in Miami or began playing in Miami and have to move north to Fort Lauderdale. And that started with the Miami Toros of the old NASL, which became the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. That continued with teams in those link leads between 84 and 96 after the NASL collapsed and MLS started. That continued with the Miami Fusion, continued with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers of NASL, who began as Miami FC and USL. And when the league rebranded, I could go through the whole story here, but just long story short, had moved to Fort Lauderdale. We're still calling themselves Miami FC. And when NASL launched, they rebranded as the Fort Lauderdale Strikers to link with the NASL heritage. And now this team. So Lockhart seems to be, for whatever reason, better or worse, always seems to be the location that pro soccer gravitates to in South Florida, just because it's central located. Dade County fans and with the city of Miami politically. And I guess that's the $6 million question, because now they've gotten their deal in Fort Lauderdale. They are going to play there the first 2 seasons. The question is, will they continue to play there after that? And the other question is, and this is what I led with, Jorge Mas, I believe, knowing the local area, thinks he's going to get more fans from the Fort Lauderdale area anyway. So would he be tempted in 2 years to stay there? Now, I don't know. I do know, though, that they want to continue to have a major presence in Broward County because, again, they think most of the fans are going to come from Broward and Palm Beach.
Which is so weird.
It is.
I'm only going to add that that's really weird when your branding was Inter Miami FC, our city, our club. If you go to Wynwood, like I work in Coral Gables, but if you go, Wynwood is great. I like to go there and watch, football in the afternoons, in the Champions League especially, because there's all these little breweries and it's great. And there's a big mural in the middle of Wynwood, an Inter Miami mural, right when they released their crest, which is the only wonderful thing they've done thus far. And it says, our city, our club. There's another one just like it in Brickell, which is downtown, closer to the Overtown location. Our city, our club. So when they said they were going to build an 18,000 seat stadium in February of 2019 in Fort Lauderdale, like Miki, I kind of thought maybe I should ask some people some questions. And I knew, because we were both waiting on public records requests from FIU, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Which they conveniently took forever to answer. And about the 13th follow-up email, my friend Lizette, I call her my friend now because I emailed her so much, finally got me my contracts. But there was no way they were going to play at FIU, and without it was. Let's put it this way: it was unlikely. So yeah, I mean, it just seemed like they're going to need a stadium. They've got all these roadblocks at Maurice. They're going to need a stadium for probably more than a year. And Jorge Mas thought, well, why don't we play in Fort Lauderdale? Because there's a train station right by Lockhart. I can get some fans from Palm Beach County. Da-da-da-da. Our city, our club, baby. Our city, our club.
Well, and just to follow up on what Kartik said about, kind of the relation between Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Seattle Tacoma, they're basically about the same distance apart. They're about 30 to 35 miles depending on how you drive it, and they are distinct cities, even though they're part of the same metropolitan area. And like up here, or I'm sure like down there, it's sometimes difficult to get Seattle people to go down to Tacoma, and vice versa. And just because of it's a bit of a trek. Not at 9:00 at night, maybe when a game's getting over, but around 7:00 when you're trying to get down to a game, it sure as hell is a problem. And so that's always been a complaint, which is what are you going to do about it? You can't move the city. But going forward, you guys talked about whether this is going to take whether they're going to be there longer than 2 years, and I think the answer is yes at this point.
I agree,
and maybe significantly longer than 2 years. Do you think how does that impact the fan base getting high profile players in there? Do you think that really matters? They talked about Griezmann coming down and wanting to play in Miami, and he once he gets there, I can imagine the joke is like, "You want me to play where?" And again, it's not that far away, but you know how people think about these things.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let Kartik jump all over this one too, because he's really the foremost authority, I think, on soccer and how it works in Fort Lauderdale. But I don't think it will affect player draw. Fort Lauderdale Beach is really nice. Like Griezmann,
that is a nice benefit.
Yeah, I mean Griezmann might think that, and then somebody will take him down to Las Olas, and all the boutiques and designer shops, and all the chefs that got tired of trying to hack it in Tribeca, and he'll be like, "All right, this
isn't so bad."
Yeah, it's not so bad. So, my bungalow has storm shutters. I'm good. So I think that they'll draw that there. What just fascinates me is how they've branded the club and what becomes of that idea that this was Miami's team. It's not going to be. So, I do wonder about that. And I also wonder from a marketing standpoint, they're still going to have access to that Miami media market, right? That Miki kind of referenced, and that's a whole different discussion, but it's obviously part of this because a big component of why MLS is so accommodating is because it's Miami.
Yeah. Same as NYCFC. It's the same thing.
What is you got to wonder what the league office thinks about it. Well, it's not Miami now. Now it's Fort Lauderdale. And while the league is drastically different than it was 20 years ago, the league still is functionally, to some extent, I'm not going to make big hot take pronouncement, but there is an argument to be made that the league is financially benefiting from a franchise bubble. And what is the impact of a Fort Lauderdale franchise within that bubble vis-a-vis a Miami franchise? And that's a discussion that should probably be had. And that's also an area where Kartik knows a lot more than I do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Neil, because the way it's been described to me all along, the desire to have a team in Miami and the pushback that's come about the Fusion having played in Fort Lauderdale has a lot to do with sponsorship, general international sponsorship, international in a room off the record. They would admit to you what I think Jorge Mas thinks, which is there are probably more fans in Fort Lauderdale or in the Fort Lauderdale area for men's professional soccer, pro club soccer. We're not talking about Barcelona and Real Madrid coming to town. We're talking about a local MLS club. There were more fans in the Fort Lauderdale area and the Boca Raton, West Palm Beach area than in Miami proper. But it's about sponsorships. It's about perception. It's about the global brand for Major League Soccer. The point about where players live, that may have factored into this decision to have the training facility in Fort Lauderdale also, because as Neil says, Fort Lauderdale Beach is very nice. Las Olas is kind of a sexy locale. We have celebrities that live in Fort Lauderdale instead of living in Miami. I mean, we even saw when Roger Stone's house was raided, his neighbor was Ocho Cinco, who grew up in Miami, who's a Miami guy, but is living in Fort Lauderdale now because for whatever reason. That I was told by a source that one of the reasons why Lockhart, they kind of settled on Lockhart rather than exploring, trying to push for the Tropical Park site, which we've now heard about publicly, but I had heard about privately a while ago, and FIU, was that those were so far west as training facilities that the players would be so far removed from the beach element or the hotspot element of South Florida. So you want to be close to South Beach if you can at the Miami Beach, but if you can't do that, you want to be close to another hotspot with a beach, Fort Lauderdale Beach, Las Olas. If you're at FIU, if you're at Tropical Park, you're out in kind of the hinterland, the areas that people like Neil and I are more comfortable operating in, and the areas where I believe there are actually far more soccer fans, in my opinion, based on my experience, around Tropical Park and around FIU than there would be around Melreese or Overtown. But they were thinking about where players would want to live and where they would hang out and then have their training facility, because that's where they work, really, right? Wherever they play their games is once a week. Wherever they train is 5 or 6 times a week. They wanted it close to an area where people would live. And so a lot of the Miami Dolphins players have always lived in the Fort Lauderdale area for the same reason. So that, I think, was part of the thought process, actually, was that, yeah, you know, a guy like Griezmann, since that name has been publicly mentioned by Paul McDonough, he might be more comfortable living in a mansion like where Roger Stone was living than living out by Florida International University, which is in a very working class area of the western part of Miami-Dade County. But again, a working class area where you have more soccer fans. So from a practical standpoint about where you want to play, FIU is a pretty good location. But Neil's already gone through why that's never going to happen.
So well, let's talk a little bit about the XFE portion of this, because obviously they came in with their proposal. They'd been working on it for far longer than MLS had, but maybe weren't ready with all of the bona fides. And then MLS comes in with their proposal, and the Fort Lauderdale commissioners basically toss FXE out the door and say, "Yeah, we're going with Beckham and Inter Miami and MLS." XFE again is not happy about this. I've spoken a little bit to them about this. I'm not sure what their next steps are going to be, if there are any. You know, obviously anybody can sue anyone, as we all well know. But just generally, your thoughts on what they did, where they went wrong, and whether they really had a chance once MLS got involved.
I think they had a chance. They just didn't have the money. And I think, you know, they're a Miami-based group that has had a lot of success bringing in South American clubs, which those bona fides are good in our area and are going to be important to Inter Miami's success. You have to be able to draw that type of fan. In many ways, Miami is a South American city. And I don't mean that in the joking sense. I mean that in a commerce sense. Its economic ties are almost more related to South America than they are to the United States, and certainly their legal community. You know, a lot of the lawyers that we work with, if their practice area doesn't involve them traveling to South America, it touches Latin America and South America. So that stuff is important from a business side. It's also important from a who your soccer fans are side. I was impressed with some of the details of their bid, to be honest.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
I thought that the proposal was fairly good. I thought that the framing of it as we're for Fort Lauderdale and they're not was bizarre, because they're based in Miami, and it never made a whole lot of sense to me. But certainly a large group of people within Fort Lauderdale latched onto it. But the city commission never did. They were outflanked, I think, one by it was just really a financial consideration. And I know this for at least 2 or 3 of the city commissioners that ended up siding with MLS. You know, their conclusion was, one, they didn't like the pie in the sky stuff in the bid. They thought that a 99-year lease was a little ridiculous. They were worried about the big retail component. They didn't want empty storefronts. And honestly, they'd heard this kind of stuff before about lower division football in Fort Lauderdale. And so they knew about that and were kind of a little uneasy unless there were checks written. And I think so to some extent that put them behind the 8 ball, and they were never really able to overcome that perception that they couldn't pay for their plan and that it was a little too ambitious, if you will, compared to what Inter Miami was doing. I think the other component of it was that Inter Miami made no secret about this is where we want our academy. So we're going to have a home here for a while anyway, even if the club's not here.
Yeah.
And they weren't too pushy with the retail component, presumably because for whatever reason, they think they're going to win at Miami Freedom Park.
Yeah.
And also, I think that Moss just was being good at politics there. He knew he would have at least one strong ally on the Fort Lauderdale City Commission, and Heather Moritas, who's a pro-business Republican that was always going to be cozy with her, cozy with Moss because of their political leanings.
Yeah.
He knew that Moritas was going to be a strong voice for a privately funded plan where they could pay for it without a big retail component that also preserved green space. Moritas is no dummy. I mean, she knows green space is important to the constituents in Fort Lauderdale, but she's also super pro-business. That seemed like a pretty happy alliance for them, and ended up being a happy alliance for the other two commissioners that were really concerned or sort of on the fence, and one being Ben Sorensen and the other being Dean Trentalis.
Yeah. So following up on that, Neil's point about the green space. So for Commissioner Moritas, this was a determining factor because her feeling was from her constituents, and she actually represents Northeast Fort Lauderdale, the area that includes Lockhart Stadium, was that they did not want retail necessarily in that complex. Now, there are retail merchants and companies. Microsoft's Latin American headquarters is a component in Silicon Valley and in the Seattle area because of the relationship with Microsoft. They are actually based in Fort Lauderdale, and they're based right down the street from Lockhart. They had a sentiment that it would be good for their employees and good for their businesses if there was retail in the neighborhood and Lockhart were redeveloped that way, which I think was something that FXC got right in terms of what the local businesses and the local companies that contribute to Fort Lauderdale's economy, Broward County's economy, wanted. But the residents of that area never wanted retail in that space. They haven't wanted retail in that space. They haven't been thrilled about the water park plans in the past. And so Commissioner Moritas reacted to that. I would also add the component of the lease. Now, this is very important because of where the city was with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, who, as we mentioned earlier, I worked with the NASL. I then left the league and then later worked for the club. And I had worked for the club prior when they were Miami FC, prior to working for the NASL. There was a fear that if you turned over the space to an outside interest, and this is not an indictment of FXC, because again, they had a creative plan and they actually had some financing, which was always like, for example, Statesboro, Georgia now with Torrenta FC, where that retail project has fallen behind with a USL League One club attached to it, and other projects like that, that if the team actually fails and the people who you've given the lease to walk away and abandon the project, because in reality, even though FXC was a soccer group, and I agree with Neil wholeheartedly, and you know what, I give a lot of credit to Onside Entertainment and JP Renal, who were FXC, but they're also Onside Entertainment. They've brought some high-level friendlies to South Florida, and they have not charged the outrage.
Yep.
I have a lot of sentiment for them, but I think the concern among the commissioners was, what if we're left holding the bag? We've given them a long-term lease. What Inter Miami just take Miami has asked for is a management agreement. It's not a lease. So that protects the city, but in a way it protects Inter Miami also. So let's say they do get what they want in Miami, and let's say that the fan base doesn't turn out in Broward County. I think it will, but let's say it doesn't, and people in Miami are angry that this Miami branded club has run off to Fort Lauderdale. They can walk away at any time. So that protects the city. The other point that I want to make with this, and Neil, you kind of touched on this, for two of the commissioners that I've spoken with, the financial aspect that was also important was the fact that there was going to be this investment in year one from Inter, a lot of millions, tens of millions of dollars in investment. Now the FXC proposal had as much in investment overall, but it was long term. It was spread out over a much longer period of time. And the status right now in Fort Lauderdale is the other primary city in this metropolitan area. I mean, people know it as the Miami Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area. Fort Lauderdale 20 years years ago was more desirable than Miami for business and for new residents and for a lot of different things. Now, and part of it is Miami's become the sexy destination it's become internationally, but Fort Lauderdale has fallen way behind Miami in terms of attracting new business, attracting tech, all of that. Even though I mentioned Microsoft a little earlier and Citrix, they want to get that back, and they want short-term kind of sexy investment that attracts that sort of innovative class of people that have kind of abandoned Fort Lauderdale for Miami over the course of the last 20 years. And attaching yourself to David Beckham does that in a big way. So that maybe that's unfortunate for FXC. Maybe long term their proposal would have been better for the city, but it's turning the tide of history right now, where in this metropolitan area, Fort Lauderdale was the place that people want a desire to live around or near or in and work in 20 years ago. Now it's Miami, so they want to try and turn the tables on that. And it's very much a rivalry between the two cities.
Yeah. We're familiar with that as well. So that's actually probably a good place to wrap up and talk about where we see things going from here. So we've got negotiations going on with the Miami City Commission. There's a vote in September on the 16th where they are going to try, fingers crossed if you're in Miami, to get the 4 votes that they need to wrap up the development and be able to start building the stadium. In the meantime, it sounds like there may be, I may have mentioned this earlier, there may be a lease between the Miami City Commissioners and Inter Miami. That needs to be obviously done. Problematic is the remediation of the Melreese. There are estimates that it could cost upwards of $30 million or maybe twice that. We don't know. It depends on, what those findings come out to, but it's, the golf course sits atop, I guess, a toxic waste dump, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And so that needs to be cleared up before they could even develop there. So, there's a point where Jorge Mas said that if the number is too high, then they won't build there, just because it's prohibitive and any business is not going to spend more than they can trying to fix up land that they don't even own technically. So, I'm not sure where do you see that going as far as the remediation as well as the negotiations, stretching out to September.
Well, it's fascinating to me that there's rumblings that they may have some sort of lease proposal tomorrow, because I think that's an effort to get out ahead of sort of the negative feedback loop over the early vote in September. And they could say, look, we've released the details to them. They can consider it. And if they're rejecting it, it's just political. But I think you bring up a great point kind of at the end here, which is that, like, say politically they even win, there's still all these other questions. Like I said at the beginning, layers and layers of questions at Miami Freedom Park, including those remediation costs. He's got this land in Overtown, and he's won in court over and over again. It's just a passion project for Jorge Mas a little bit. I mean, he's going to invest his money in MLS, and I'm sure he thinks at some point, he'll make some money, I guess, but not really.
He's already admitted that stadium development on its own is not an economic driver, which I'm sure he admitted has annoyed other MLS owners, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, he's conceded that publicly, which doesn't happen that often.
Points for honesty.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think, and the other thing that he did, which was unusual, and I thought actually kind of brilliant, because, I've been very hard on them, so I'll give him credit for this. I thought the statements that came off a little salty, but the day after the Fort Lauderdale approval.
Oh, yes.
I thought
late night tweeting.
I thought that was masterful. Like, well, Fort Lauderdale's forward thinking, look at Fort Lauderdale being innovative. And, I think that
some reverse psychology.
Yeah, because there's an argument that's been made, and I think accurate, about Melreese, that the golf course was going to need work anyway. There's going to have to be some sort of, it's not going to cost what a full remediation would, but either way, that there's going to be large scale investment and change to that green space. I think that that's inevitable. And he's kind of making the argument like you can be innovative about it, and we're still going to have green space for not just the stadium, but some of that there would be parks, etc. So I think he's setting up a pretty aggressive framing campaign to try to win that vote in September, which is why I've been a little more optimistic about it than other people.
Me included.
Yeah, but I don't know what those back end costs are, which is I think why the point you bring up is so vital, because and also why I think you're looking at least 3 years in Fort Lauderdale, in my opinion.
Yeah, I just don't see how they get even if they get a number they like for remediating Melry. That's going to take 18 months at least.
Yep, absolutely.
It still has to be done, and I think just as a point of background here, the point Neil has made is so right about Jorge Mas basically being very honest about stadiums, because we've been burnt in South Florida, both in Broward and Miami-Dade County. Obviously, we've talked about the Marlins, but I think Broward has been burnt by the building an arena for the Florida Panthers that, if not for concerts and special events, would not be providing any benefit to taxpayers, quite frankly, and founder and president of the Cuban American National Foundation, was a guy that was a prominent in Republican political circles, did an incredible job in influencing federal elections. And anyone wants to hit me up privately and talk about Jorge Mas Canosa and what he did and some of how that can, if you want lessons in real politique and how to play the political game in this country, he's a guy that did that. But where it relates to Jorge Mas, besides being Mas Canosa's son, is that he knows the psychology. The tweet was very strategic to me. I talked a little earlier about Fort Lauderdale having been the desirable destination in the 90s and the early 2000s, and Miami pulling it back. And there's been always a competition between the two cities. And two of those commissioners in Miami, Gort and Carollo, two guys sitting on the fence, are guys who in the 1990s were decrying, we're losing all our business, we're losing potentially the Orange Bowl game, we're losing events to Broward County, we're losing events to Fort Lauderdale. There was a basketball tournament that moved. There was the Orange Bowl game that moved. There were and grab that back from Fort Lauderdale, which is why I mentioned earlier Fort Lauderdale very badly. Two of the commissioners that I've spoken with, people around them, wanted to see Fort Lauderdale begin to pull things back from Miami, and including this culture of innovation, culture of getting young professionals and millennials to buy into Fort Lauderdale as a destination versus Miami. Mas's strategy was talking about innovation in the tweet, talking about Fort Lauderdale being proactive and progressive, or he hit all the buzzwords, and those of us who are locals know what he was doing, and he was playing right at Gort and Carollo, who are guys who in the 90s fought the flight of these things to Fort Lauderdale, now have had success pulling things back to Miami, and he's saying, hey, it's happening again, and I pulled something from you to Fort Lauderdale unless you play the debate. I have a feeling it might get the city the ball with the crawl back. I'm kind of where Neil is. I think the city, I'm hedging very much on it. I'd say it's 50-50 now.
So one thing I did hear on that point is maybe that the development is scaled back partially. Maybe it just includes the stadium and not so much of the office development. Now, given that Mas has said that stadiums aren't economic drivers on their own, and presumably wouldn't be able to make as much money, do you think that is something that he would consider, or do you think he's going to go gung ho for the expansive 150 plus acre development?
So that's kind of an important point about Overtown, just because it's not as much land.
Yeah.
And this idea that stadiums aren't economic drivers on their own. But as much as I'd like to consider him this noble guy that cares what the Overtown Development Board thinks, we have to be there's an element of realism that has to be factored into that. And maybe, I guess, if he could do a retail piece say he's got his academy in
Fort
he's got
Lauderdale.
his academy in Fort Lauderdale. Maybe they can do a retail component there, because Kartik mentioned some of the companies, right? Some of the companies that were interested in that are headquartered in that area. Greenspoon Martyr is a very large law firm that's headquartered in Fort Lauderdale. It's in 40 states. They've been begging for retail in that area, and they're about 1.5 miles down the road. So, I mean, I guess that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it was just something that was suggested to me in my discussions.
It's possible. I doubt it is my answer. I doubt it.
So that kind of takes care of where the Miami City Commission is. They've got a potential draft lease to consider. They got remediation. They've got the vote in September. They got the elections in November. The one thing, actually, I did want to just quickly follow up with on Neil. We had discussed previously what happens if they lose that vote in November. What happened to the referendum? I haven't been able to get an answer on that. My source didn't specifically know. They basically said that, well, if you got 4 votes on the commission, you can basically do whatever you want. Within reason, obviously. So, potentially they could bring this back up in 6 months or after the election if they get a more favorable composition of the council. But I haven't been able to figure that out. So it's just I don't know. You mentioned that they may have to wait a year.
Well, by rule, if they don't have the 4 votes, the city bylaws mandate that it goes back to a public bidding process. So, and that has to be for a period of 1 year, unless there's a city commission waiver of that process. So, of course, the unless means if there's a more favorable city commission, then they can go right back at it again. But there's not really any indication right now of the candidates vying for Gort's seat that they would be any more favorable to that. And certainly if they want to get reelected, they might not be able to come in if that's a point of contention in the campaign. If you lose the vote,
and then come back in, reverse it.
Come back in, and they're like, you know what, I actually like this now. And it's like, well, that's cool. You like your 2-year term too, so your 4-year term. All
right. So last thing, there are a number of lawsuits that we talked about, or referenced, I should say. By my count, we've got 4. 2 from Bruce Matheson. Again, one that I didn't even know about. And then David Winker and then Douglas Muir. They're all in various states of the legal process. I think they're all on appeal, actually, as a matter of fact, because Beckham's won.
Are they all on appeal now?
I think the Matheson one is at the Supreme Court, the first one on the Overton site. The Melreese one that he just lost, I think they're just announcing an appeal on that. Or maybe they've announced they're going to appeal. I don't know if they've appealed yet.
Okay.
And then the David Winker one is on appeal. His is at trial level. His is at trial level. And then Douglas Muir's is at the appeals level. So
so one is still in circuit court.
Yes, one is still circuit court level. So again, I don't think that any of these are going to go anywhere at this point, as far as the plaintiffs prevailing. I'm not a lawyer down there, but I've reviewed the statutes fairly thoroughly in my writings, and it looks like the cities/counties have done their homework in doing these the proper way. So, Neil, you can comment on this briefly, but I don't see much chance of advancement for any of these lawsuits.
No, I thought the best one was the one that's at the trial court level about the actual referendum process, but the vote. Looking at some of the exhibits that were attached to the answer, at least that Inter Miami filed, some of their affirmative defenses were like, there was an election. It's kind of like, okay, thanks for that. So no, I don't think the lawsuits are any more than whatever, an annoyance and really good billable hours for MLS lawyers.
I think it's just essentially it's just taking it's a hassle for them, that's for sure. I would have thought if they were going in Overton, if they were sticking with that site, they probably could have tried to push it through and start developing there. But obviously they didn't do that for reasons that we've discussed. So it'll be interesting to see if they get a favorable vote on the Melreese site, how the lawsuits impacted. Someone try to get an injunction or otherwise gum up those works, because that's certainly going to take some time, even if they ultimately prevail.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that the idea of a new wave of litigation, even if they win in September.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that closes this up. Unless you guys had anything else, I think we had a pretty good discussion here. So I hope people enjoy it, and I'll let everyone plug their other stuff before we get out of here. Kartik, you can go first.
Oh yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at KKFLA737, and all the sites I mentioned earlier, right for, and obviously been all over this situation, and it's going to continue to play out in the next. By the time you guys watch this hangout, we might have new developments, and we very well could tomorrow, as has been mentioned.
Yeah, we really might have new ones tomorrow. But you can find me on Twitter at NW Blackmon, BLACKMON. You can read me at Yanks Are Coming, a variety of other places. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Mickey.
Yeah, thanks. And you can find me on Twitter at TurnerESQ, socceresq.com is a website, and I also contribute at The Athletic. And so I want to thank Neil and Kartik for joining me. And yeah, like I said, watch out for tomorrow. We may have some more interesting stuff to tweet about. And I want to thank everyone for listening, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.